And we are back, mostly.
Mostly.
Yes.
And hopefully we can get this one accomplished.
Absolutely. A little bit different approach.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what they say, when life gives you lemons, make omelets.
We're going to try. And now we are in ye old English Inn.
Yes. This is you all's guest room, actually.
Yes.
And this portion of the inn was built in 1913. And it's built like a rock.
Yes, and the reason that we aren't doing this live is it's built like a rock.
Yes. You have walls made of native Ozark stone that are about as thick as a traditional English castle.
Yes.
And reception drops rapidly. Yes. So up a creek without a paddle, take two. With a little bit of a different location, talking about how perception, folklore, just your overall, all these different opinions, really, and reasons for opinions, play into how a story is perceived, what is recorded, and the fact that there's not to excessive, no, we want to use our tagline, but to use our tagline, there are no easy answers in many of these stories.
That's very, very true. And maybe an example might kind of help illustrate what we're talking about. And how about something fun?
Like the Legend of Bogey Creek?
Exactly.
So for people who don't know, of course, the basis of Legend of Bogey Creek, two films, ultimately, filmed locally in the late 1970s. And around the Texarkana area, and that is at the southwest corner of Arkansas, just as you're really the convergence there of Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas.
Right.
And so it's on the south of the Ouachita Mountains. It's really not a mountainous area.
Yeah, it's almost like a floodplain. There's a lot of swamps.
Yeah, and of course Bogey Creek, and then the monster for which Bogey Creek gave its name.
Also known as the Folk Monster.
Correct.
For Folk,
Arkansas. Yeah. Foulke. Yeah. Yep. I took my spelling. But there's, the movie. I think it's probably questionable how well the movie has actually, dated itself.
Yes, and I think part of that was production value because they were kind of doing this on a shoestring.
Yeah. Still cool.
Yes.
Still cool. We got to watch it late last year.
Oh, January.
January. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's been a lot of year under the bridge in 2020. But we got to watch it at the Coleman. Of course, neat to see it on the big screen.
Yeah.
We enjoyed it.
Yeah, we did a lot.
But I do, even though it is lower production values, there is a cool quality to it.
It really is. I mean, and some things were done really well, and some things maybe not so well. But I think one thing that was done well was the sense of what the legend did for the area leading up to the events, because this wasn't something that just happened in a vacuum and you had a monster encounter. This is something that there were legends, there were sightings, and I thought they did a good job of that precursor.
Yeah, and of course telling that story is, I think especially from that perspective, going just into film narrative, my hat's off to them in terms of creating a structural narrative that told a comparatively quite complex story. Many of the very beautiful high budget films that we see today are not telling a complex narrative.
No.
And some of them I love, but they're not. So from your perspective, I've only seen the first film all the way through once, and that was the Coleman. So you're more familiar with some of the more nuanced areas of this. Give me your thoughts on how the complexities played a role in this.
I think, for one thing, they did a good job of showing people who had personal experiences, others who had just didn't believe anything, even though legends had been going around for years. And so you had a tension between people personally involved, and the narrator I thought was the cohesion in the film.
Yeah.
And someone that had an experience as a young boy, and then later was involved in the search for the monster.
Yes.
When the big media show happened.
Right. Right.
And then in the end, he kind of pulls it together with his internal thoughts of whether or not it happened, the events depicted in the early 70s happened, compared to his experience and what it meant.
Right.
And and
that's a very good point.
You know, I think more of the problem of the narrative was the portrayal of the events themselves and the people involved in that encounter.
And that can be very difficult.
What did you think?
Well, first of all, I would definitely agree with that. And a couple of things. One thing that we were talking about on our previous attempt with what reception, but something that I think is really crucial in understanding, we tend to live in a bombastic pop culture, media saturated, but often soulless and clinical world. And so it's very easy to bandy about the term science and bandy about the term objective data.
Right.
And go in, let's for example go in to analyze the Bogey Creek story and conclude this or conclude that, and you're concluding a very sanitized or sometimes very dismissive thing.
Right.
Without realizing that for some people, this is not just, is there a monster in Bogey Creek or is there not? This is an integral part of the tapestry of their lives. For example, their story, possibly their parents' story, possibly their grandparents' story. This is more than, is there a monster?
Yes.
This is a combined, and tapestry would be my best word for it, a combined series of elements about someone's being. And you come in and you start poking holes in that. You are not, from their perspective, you are not poking. You are not just saying, is it there? Is it not? It doesn't really matter. You are picking apart a portion of who they are.
Right.
And anytime that we can do that, not pick things apart, but anytime that we can approach subject matter in a way that is respectful to the individuals that the source is around or is associated with, and understand that that's part of them, I think that is crucial. And it is something I do really like about the film, is that it was filmed by individuals who were closely associated with the region.
Yes.
In all fairness, with some lower production qualities, and not, in some cases, not the best acting in the world.
Right.
I'm the first one to say that. It is evident that it was shot lovingly for the region, for the people, and even for me. Of course, I was born in the late '70s, but I remember a lot of things, and looking at it, going, I remember a world that looked like this.
Yeah. And that is one great thing about it is it's a very good period piece as far as that is that it does a good job of, this is the world that we lived in, and it did a good job of portraying a lot of areas of the Ozarks in that time period, the small town life and so forth.
It did, and they took moments. The cinematography takes moments to just explore feelings, I would say, the sun through the yellow pines and the sounds of the swamp, and there's some really, really neat qualities to it. If you don't believe your ancestors, Daisy Duke shorts were a real thing.
Yeah, and this was done before Daisy Duke. So.
Yes, pre-Daisy Duke shorts, but they were Daisy Duke shorts. Yes. But it is beautifully done. I think it's done tenderly, and but
and I think in the event, and if anyone that's not seen the movie or familiar with the legend, you have two young couples with kids who end up renting a house because the guys have gotten these jobs and they're basically trying to get started.
Yes.
And they're working late, mid-shift or something, and so the wives start having these experiences with something on the property.
Yes.
And they're not believed by their husbands, by the neighbors, the landlord, etc. And but then the problem the biggest problem I found was it kind of fell apart a little bit in the portrayal of what happened.
Yeah.
But if you can get past that, it's good.
Yeah, it is a cautionary tale about not going to the bathroom.
Well, and I guess that's the one thing is, and I think in the end, something that I'm not trying to give everything away, but really didn't make sense for a character to do in the circumstances.
Yeah.
But in the end, that character was a nephew or something. Tommy, I think is his name. He ends up being really the most realistic character. And he ends up basically ignoring or putting away the experience and hiding from it almost.
Yeah.
But it is a cautionary tale in telling a story, I think, in that it wasn't fully told for the people that actually went through the event.
Right. Right. And there were some, for all of our aforementioned sort of tenderness about it, there were some artistic licenses taken in dramatizing a situation in which, in the film, the monster attacks.
Right.
And in real life, from what we've heard,
right,
that did not happen. That the monster, the cryptid in question seemed to be very interested for some reason about the house.
Right.
Not necessarily the people in the house.
Right.
Or accosting them through the window as they sat down on the toilet.
Right. I mean, it almost turned into a slasher film.
Like it was leaning that way.
Before there really were slasher films.
This is true. We might actually find this film as a watershed inspiration for a number of things that happened in the 80s. We don't know.
Well, yeah, actually for films, yes. I think some horror films. But I think they tried to tell more of a story, and I think they had just told the story as it happened, because it was very effective in telling some of the other experiences people had.
Yes, it was. It really was. And we dug into this at the Coleman with a lot of individuals. So I think this, coming sort of around full circle in terms of a real life event, creating art, and then the art coming around to a real life event. We showed the film, and the events at the Coleman are very interactive.
Yes.
Shameless plug, June 27th.
We will be there. Come on out.
Yes, Coleman Theater in Miami, Oklahoma. We hope you all will join us there. And a number of individuals came forward with stories.
Yes.
Something that I know is important to both of us is that we strive to create a respectful space for individuals coming forward with stories. That this is not, neither one of us, even though there are many unanswered questions, and we, from both of our perspectives, we cannot approach every possible story with just a completely, what's the word for it, like just saying, yeah, of course we believe everything that everybody has ever told us.
Right.
We have to bring a level of skepticism. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we cannot be humble. It does not mean that we cannot be open-minded. And most importantly, regardless of the factual reality, that the stories that people tell are important to their, essentially their cosmology, or their,
worldview.
Their worldview. I see storytelling has been turned into almost a pastiche.
Yes.
It's one of those things. It's like I don't know, like the fancy hors d'oeuvres that you never order because you don't know what they are, and without realizing that this storytelling is how we make sense of a world that doesn't make sense.
Right.
And so, no matter how potentially either beautiful or absurd or fantastical or bizarre or believable, it doesn't matter. At some point, you have to, I think, the humane approach, the intelligent approach, is to understand that what someone else is telling you is how they're making sense of the world. And to approach that disrespectfully is to disrespect the person.
Right. And I think that was one shortfall in the movie is that even though it was a very loving portrayal, that center part of the movie turned into a slasher film.
Yes.
I
A slasher film that probably didn't quite know what to make of itself.
Right.
Because the story material really doesn't give. I mean, no one was like slashed apart in real life. No one was mauled ultimately. There was an encounter.
Right.
There was a reported encounter, but it was not being stalked by, it was not Jaws.
No, or even, it wasn't even, being grabbed or something. I mean, it was, but that giving into that sensationalism and in the context of the rest of the story, I think they just told it the way it was. It would have been actually
probably stronger.
Yeah. And I know that some of the people who had the encounter have pulled back and refrained from public comment over the years, and I have to wonder if that's part of the reason.
Part of the process, and that level of sudden being dropped into the public eye, and something that is always very troubling to me is the idea that we're essentially this idea of capitalizing off of the hillbilly sideshow.
Right.
And I think that's very dangerous. I think that's problematic, to say the least. And again, it's one of those things that I feel like, again, coming back to our events at Coleman, so many of the people who come forward at Coleman, they do exist within a grounded community. They're individuals who are invested in their community. They're not seeking attention.
No, or profit of any kind.
No, and the feeling that I get off of so many is a sense of saying, almost, would you please respect my story?
Yes.
I can't even make sense of it myself.
Right.
But I know that I experienced something. That experience is now part of my compass points trying to make sense of the world. And will you please just listen?
And I think that's the key, is portraying, as we tell these stories, portraying it in that manner and not giving into the fear of it. Is it enough entertainment?
Yeah. I think telling and of course part of that is co-managers and co-producers and our editorial structure is choosing material that is enough,
right,
that you do not have to embellish it in order to have something.
That's true. And sometimes you can have, in that situation, you have something to tell a story and they still. And that can
be unfortunate.
Yeah, and so that's a problem, and that can lead to being up a creek without a paddle.
Yes, it can. And a concept that, of course, with State of the Ozarks that we talk about a lot is community. Community is very balancing. It keeps things from going, from becoming too polarized or swinging too far one side or the other. You can have a lot of extreme differences, but you know what? If you're still going to see this person at the coffee shop or the bank, or is going to be your neighbor, at the end of the day, y'all have to get along.
Right.
And I feel like when individuals tell stories and they know that at the end of the shoot, they're probably never even going to be in the state again.
Right.
There is an openness to throw some of that caution to the wind.
I think that's true. And that's something that we are avoiding, and we do live here.
Yes. You and I cannot afford to do that, because
Yeah.
the people that we're telling these stories, they are our neighbors. They are these are people that we would see around and about the Ozarks,
Yeah.
and there's a grounding
Mm-hmm.
in that, and it's so many of these stories that we've covered week after week. You don't have to sensationalize them. They are extraordinary, standing on their own merits.
Exactly. And so I think that's again, that's the problem you get when you kind of go down the creek without a paddle,
Yes.
and, for a certain position.
And I do think that there's an element, whether it's wanting to dive into create a slasher horror, whether it's a lot of different possible aspects. It's really, I think it's looking for too easy of an answer.
Well, I do too. I do too, because sometimes it is ambiguous.
It is, and that's troubling. We want our cosmology to be nice and tidy. We don't want to get to the end of the story and still be wondering why.
Well, and I guess that's the flip side where where we delve into folklore a lot, but folklore does have that tidy bow at the end.
Yes,
To tie it up.
It can, and I think there is a certain amount of catharsis to that. It reminds me was on a Halloween ghost tour. This was quite some time ago in a historic location, and I actually, as a journalist, I spent more time. I won't say where, but it was a beautiful location, and I actually spent more time watching the crowd
Yeah.
than looking for ghosts. It was very Halloween themed. They had scavenged the Walmart for props, which was cute. But I looked at it. It was a very even demographic, except for me. But it was a very
Josh is usually the odd man out.
very much so. Many levels. But it was a very even demographic. It was mid-30s ish couples, and this was basically their date night.
Right.
I was there as a journalist, and so I was working. For them, this was their night off.
Right.
Halloween time, what other time to go visit a haunted location, that kind of thing. And at the beginning, they were laughing, they were joking, they were kind of making fun of it, and then the tour guide began telling real stories, and the real stories were very, they were creepy. They were, people being touched, knockings, phantom footsteps, those types of things. Disembodied bodies, coming, into contact with something, but then not having something.
Right.
And as these stories continue, you could watch the tenor of the room begin to chill. The couples were like, "Is this real? Is this not real? I'm uncomfortable now." And I, really just kind of put my antenna up to see what I could soak up. Basically, the Halloween decorations, and some great shots because it's a beautiful location. And I won't say where because I don't want to put down the tour. It was a good tour. And as the
Not mine.
No. No. And as we went on, the mood became more and more somber, and you could see that these folks were going, "What if this is real?" And you could see as that was happening, they're going, "Wait, what's the logical conclusion if this is real? If this is real, my worldview doesn't make sense anymore.
Right.
This is no longer comfortable. I've got my mortgage and my dog and my 2.3 kids and my 2.3 car garage, and it's not. None of that is quite making sense anymore.
Right.
There was an agitation that built through the process, and we got to the final section, and they said, "Everybody, get out your iPhones and look for orbs," and then varying people were just sort of chasing their phones around the room. But I think I see one. I think I see one. and I didn't have my smartphone at the time, and I was taking photos with just my SLR Canon camera, a good camera, and I'm picking up nothing. There's no light artifacts that's going to be showing up on a decent camera and that. But there was also something very odd about this process. As people were looking and feeling like they were seeing things with their phone, it suddenly brought it all back. Oh, look, I'm in control of it again. It's in my phone. It's sort of like I captured it.
So now I control it. I can. It almost reminds me of the old Bugs Bunny cartoon, with the monster. And I'm going to name him George.
Yes,
with Daffy
love
Duck.
him and hug him and squeeze him and name him George. That giant fur monster.
Yes, and,
yeah.
And that's I've seen that process on tours before, and I've also seen the process of wait a minute, where grown men, grown women, often older than me, as we're going through a tour, and they start out whatever, and they go through this process, and then suddenly I have someone latch onto my arm and hold my arm the entire night. And because suddenly they are not sure of themselves walking through a building without being locked on my arm.
Yes, and having that sense of safety. Please bring that sense of safety. Like a toddler.
Yes, yes.
In an unknown location. And the thing that I felt like ultimately for the tour, which was not yours, that at the end of the day I felt like cheapened it was to own the experience with their technology, so that you could then, and you saw them, they brightened up, everything was coming back to normal, and they could walk out with no aspect of their worldview changed.
And no, I don't do that.
I know you don't.
I leave them uncomfortable.
And I think it is for things like this, it is so crucial. I think it's crucial for respect. I think it's crucial for humility. For all of us, every single one of us going into these spaces, we've talked a lot about respect within these spaces, to understand that being uncomfortable is okay.
Yes.
And being willing to not know is okay.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the turn of the 20th century. There was a group of individuals, I can't name them, but they lobbied hard to close the U.S. Patent Office because they believed that after the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, there was no new thing that could ever be created to be patented.
Right.
Just a smidge short-sighted. And I think we are at that place again every time.
Well, yes, and people think that I have all the answers, and nothing, and everything fits in my box.
Yeah.
And so, yes, as we go along, we don't want you to feel like everything is in a box.
My only problem as we get further into this, I just want to conjure a tulpa. That would be very handy.
Well, yes, and now we just went down the rabbit hole of voodoo. See what I have to deal with.
It's not UFOs, it's voodoo. What about voodoos and UFOs?
I know, Josh.
For anyone who knows me, they know I have a very odd cosmology.
Yes.
But it keeps me somewhat level.
There you go. But I mean that is true. I mean, it's almost as if you could conjure a tulpa, or for other connotations, think the genie in the bottle, maybe. It certainly would help kind of control the ambiguity that
it's rarely an option.
it is.
And I think whether it's with paranormal, with ET, George Lucas's Indigenous Species, not bringing up the crystal skull, but or magic is we want a tidiness about it, that the subject matter does not allow.
Well, and the flip side of that, it doesn't even have to be these more unknown or esoteric topics.
Sure.
People are very ingrained in their perspective for events from, say, the Civil War.
Yes.
I mean, and, you know, we've just recently gotten comments on stories that, you know, well, you know, I've not heard this before, this and that, and being uncomfortable with the information presented.
Yes.
And so it really goes to all aspects
It does.
of life,
It
whether
does.
it's
and it of course can cover, which we won't get into, but you know, contemporary events, is what's going on right now, which of course we are, you know, very well aware of. But we're choosing to talk about other things, and or just, you know, the history of a town, or the history of a family.
yes, and I've seen that before too. You know, that, you know, just people not wanting particular events talked about, even though
Yes.
they happened.
Yes.
And they may have happened to a family member 100 years ago, but and so we try to be very respectful in how we portray that.
It is, and something that I've seen a lot of the time. It's very important, of course, uncomfortable history. It's very important that we don't sweep it under the rug.
Right.
And I think that there are times, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to jump back into, you know, history 100 years ago. The Ozarks were a place of race riots at that time, and there are locations that have attempted to move on without any sense of catharsis. And I think it can be problematic, it can be very troubling for them. And I think part of it is that our past is part of our identity. And we can say, well, let's just get rid of that, or let's forget it. You can't.
No.
Because it was objectively the past. Now, the beautiful thing is, it is also the past.
Right. You don't have to relive it.
We do not have to relive it, but I think we do have to accept it.
Right. And that's not always done easily.
No.
And
many times it's very hard.
it really is.
But I think, and this is just me kind of, you know, going off on my tangent. Since I don't get a tulpa, I get to do this. But can please have a tulpa? For people who don't know, please tell people what a tulpa is.
Well, tulpa is a voodoo conjuring that usually is helpful. But usually is helpful, but you have to tend to it.
Yes.
So otherwise, he gets bored and goes off and does things. It's kind of like Josh. So I'm not sure. It might just be.
It might just be me.
Yeah, maybe you are the tulpa.
I will be accepting gifts of whiskey and sweets. But I think that, again, this is just kind of me going off on a theoretical tangent. But I think that when we push